Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the ServiceNow Pro Tips YouTube channel. I'm Tim Woodruff, and today we're going to learn about having multiple custom output transitions from a single workflow activity. Here, I've got an example catalog item with only one question on it, just to use as a demo of this functionality. What we want to do is perform some logical calculation or check some value programmatically, and then execute a different workflow path depending on what we find. In this tab, I've also got an example workflow, which is what runs on my catalog item that I just showed you. So first, let's check it out so that I can edit it. Normally, I would double check at this point before I checked it out that I had an update set selected that was in the appropriate scope and all that good stuff so that I don't lose my work. But in this case, since it's just a demo in my personal developer instance, I'm not too worried about it. So let's say that what we want to do is take the person that we put in that variable on the catalog item. It's a reference to the user table, by the way. We want to check whether that person has a title that contains one of a few strings, like CEO, CIO, or COO. And if so, then we'll have an executive execution path for our workflow. If not, then we want to check if the person is anyone else's manager. And if so, we'll have a manager execution path as well. Finally, if neither of those conditions are true, then we'll send the workflow down an individual contributor execution path. So let's start by adding the script activity. We grab it from the right and drag it over onto the blue line here, or onto the gray line, which will turn blue. And that allows us to drop it directly into the transition from beginning to end. We're going to call it something like, let's say, check user, let's say check seniority, and then we needed to have a script. So let's write the script. Now again, what we want to do is take the user in that variable, and we want to check whether they have a title that contains CEO, CIO, or COO, and if not, then we want to check if they're a manager. And if neither of those are true, then we want to return individual contributor. The way that we're going to tell the workflow what the result of our script will be is by using the activity.result object. So we'll start with activity.result equals check seniority. We'll of course then have to declare check seniority. And if any of you have read my book, the ServiceNow Development Handbook, you know that it's important, it's a really good idea to write not only dry code, DRY, don't repeat yourself, but also to write pure code. Pure code means code that doesn't depend on the state in which it runs. So any function that's pure, when the same input is passed into it, regardless of what else is happening in the global or higher order scopes, will always return the same value, will always do the same thing. So in order to make this check seniority function pure, we're going to pass in the value of the variable that we're checking. To do that, we'll type in current.variables.user, and that's going to pass in the value that this returns. And just to be hyper pedantic and make sure that I'm getting the primitive value that I expect, I'm going to also add .toString. Now we also have to tell the function that we're expecting that value, so we'll call it user. And now in the scope of this function, we have that variable available to us. And that should contain the string value of the sysID of the user who we selected in that variable. But because we want our code to be error correcting and clever, we're also going to add a little bit of checking. So if not user, then return individual contributor. And we'll just call that our default value for this function. Now, the first thing we wanted to check is whether or not the user has a title that contains CEO, CIO, or COO. So we need to declare a glide record on the users table, And we can just use .get with the user's sysid. And then gr_user is then the glide record of the user that we put into that variable. Now we want to get the title. So because I'm pedantic, let's go ahead and hoist that variable. Hoisting is where you declare a variable at the top of your function or scope in order to sort of write your code in the same way that the JavaScript interpreter is going to execute it. This also prevents weird issues with scoping, especially in ES6, which, since ServiceNow only supports up to ES5 on the server, we're not going to have to worry about ES6, but still, this is just me being pedantic. So, user title equals gr_user.getValue title. Now at this point we want to compare the title to each of the values that we specified. But in order to make this a little bit more modular, let's go ahead and specify the values in an array and then loop over that array. So let's say executive titles equals this here array. CEO, CIO, COO. And now we can add to this or change it or remove values from it later on as the company grows and titles change. Maybe later we're going to have a CFO, so I would want to add that here, or I could predict that need, and so I can maybe add it here now. So actually, now that I have a list of titles, the question is, would a C-level executive's title contain CEO, CIO, etc., or would it simply be that exactly? I think it would probably be that exactly. So instead of sort of looping through each of those and seeing if the user's title contains that, we can simply say if the array of all the values that we're looking for in executive titles contains the user's title, then we know we have a match. So if executive titles.index of user title is greater than or equal to 0, then we return executive. So that's our first condition. If the user that we select has a title which exactly matches one of the things in our executive titles array, then we execute the executive workflow sort of path. And I'll show you how to do that later on. But next, we need to check if there are any other users which have this user as a manager. So we need to actually create another glide record. Let's call it gr direct report new glide record sys user. We only need to know if there are any users who have this person as their manager. So we can set the limit to 1 in order to optimize our database query, because we only need to know if there is one or more, and it doesn't matter how many there are in between. So we can then say gr direct report dot set limit 1, but before that we want to add our query. So gr direct report dot add active query. So the first thing we want to do is make sure we're getting active users. We want to know if this person is the manager of anybody who is an active user. We also want to know gr direct report dot add query if their manager is the selected user. Then we set the limit to 1, which we already did, and then we run our query. Gr direct report dot query, and if gr direct report dot next, well then the activity.result should be set to manager. So we're going to return manager. And finally, if neither of those two things returned, then what we're going to do is return individual contributor, and that's the end of our function. So this is kind of like, I could have put this in an else block. In fact, I could have put all of this in an else block here, but because the if block contains a return, it's not necessary to have an else, because the else is implied after a return. Because if it returns, then everything stops executing inside this function. That also allows me to kind of optimize things a little bit. So as you can see, doing this extra query is not super database intensive because we've set limit 1 and we've been very clever about how we've done the query, but it is a query. And an additional query, if it's not necessary, is a bad thing. So the first thing that we did is we checked this sort of simpler thing first. We checked the title, which we got from the glide record that we already had. And only that didn't cause us to halt execution on this function by returning. Only then do we do the work of checking if the user is anybody's manager. So now that we've got that function written, and we're calling it and setting activity.result to the results of that function, we can take this whole script, drop it into our workflow activity script here, make sure we don't have any errors, everything looks good, and let's set a stage just for fun. We'll call it fulfillment. Then we'll submit. Now, activity.result is something that we can use to determine the output transitions here. So by default, script activities just have one output transition, and that's always. So this output transition is always going to run. It's always going to do, this thing that this line points to. But I'm not a fan of that, so we're going to change it. We change it by right-clicking on the header and going to add condition. We'll give this transition a name. We'll call it executive, just so we know what we're looking at. The short description, call it the selected user is an executive. And for our condition, we're going to put activity.results triple equals, because we want to do a strict comparison in JavaScript to avoid unintended type coercion, even though JavaScript is right coercive, so this wouldn't be an issue in this particular case anyway. Again, it's just me being pedantic, which everyone I think should be, but that's mainly because I'm a pedant. So, activity.result is executive. So in that script, if I come back to the script here, we're setting activity.result to the value of this that this function returns, and if the title of the current user is in executive titles, then we return executive. That also happens to be what we're looking for here. That doesn't just happen to be, that's why we're looking for it here. So we set the activity result in the script, and now we're checking the activity result in the condition. This is activity.result is shared between the conditions and the scripts. So it's kind of similar to something like G-Scratchpad or Workflow Scratchpad, but not really. It's like result or activity specific. So anyway, this is the name, so this is what we're going to see here. So we've got always and executive. Now I don't want always, because our script has sort of what you might consider an everything other than these two conditions. So individual contributor fires if these two things don't fire. So that can be sort of thought of as the always condition. So we could sort of stop with manager. We could do executive and manager and then have, well, no, I guess we couldn't. So always will actually fire no matter what we do. So hypothetically, we could have executive and always fire. I don't want that. So I'm going to delete And it's kind of a small area here, so you have to be careful that you're right-clicking on the right thing. And delete. And now we have no more always condition. So if I were to do this, this script would run every time, but it would only end, there would be sort of unterminated paths like manager and individual contributor. These are unterminated paths in this workflow. That would be no good. The workflow would continue executing forever. So that's why it's a good thing that we have a sort of catch-all condition here. And now let's create a condition for it. Actually, first we're going to do manager. The selected user is a manager of another one or more other users. And activity.result equals manager. And there we have manager as well. So one more to add. The name will be individual contrib. It's not an executive spelled correctly, or a manager. I'm not even going to try to spell that again because I'm having a very difficult typing day today. So I'm just going to copy and paste. There we go. Now, if an error occurs in your script for some reason, I mean, you can wrap everything in try-catch blocks, and you can have, so for example, let's say I wrap this whole thing in a try block. And then I have my catch, ex, return that, right? So I can, again, I can sort of more robustly default to individual contributor. If for some reason, if my code is broken, which never happens, it does all the time, but if my code is broken or something like that, then this try block is going to catch that issue. It's going to catch the exception, so the exception won't be thrown. I could return, like I could do gs.error and pass along the message spelled correctly, and then still return. And that would probably be more useful if something does go wrong. I can figure out what it was. But this allows me to be a little bit more robust with my default. Because otherwise, if there's a script error and I don't catch it by using a try-catch block, then what's going to happen is the workflow is just going to sort of stall. If you go to view the workflow context, you're going to get a big red script box here. That's going to tell you there was an error. Nobody likes errors. So for our example, we're just going to have all three output conditions transition to the end block. And we're going to publish. Now, if I go back to my catalog item, I should be able to select somebody like me and click Order Now. And hopefully, if my code was written correctly, I'll go into the rhythm and show workflow. Fingers crossed. Hey, it looks like it executed successfully. Oh, you know what? It didn't. It didn't actually transition. You can tell because it's still executing. And I know why that was. That is because I was a little bit too pedantic. So let me check this out again. And this is why we smoke test. We test all of our execution paths before we complete code. So what I did just there is I checked it out and then I double-clicked on the output condition here for manager. And I need to actually use double equals because activity.result is probably not a string. So I need to make use of the right coercive nature of JavaScript to cast that to a string. Or I could just use .toString. But in this case, I'm going to be a little bit lazy and just use double equals. So I was pedantic in my use of the strict comparator, but I was not pedantic in my casting of the variables that I'm using to the types that I expect. And that's one of the reasons JavaScript can be a really harsh mistress at times. So we are going to go ahead and go back to the catalog item. And, well, I should, of course, check this in. Publish it so we can actually use it. I've got my name in there. I'm going to order now. That should submit the requested item. And show workflow. And there we go. And you can see the path that we took is blue. It is manager. And the reason for that is that if I go over to my profile in here, this is the profile I selected, and I look at my direct reports, it turns out I have direct reports. I put these in there before we got started in order to test that. Now, if I were to change my title to CEO, and let's say going back to submit that again, and we should see when we go and have a look at the workflow, we should see that the first transition, the executive transition, is what fired. And we can see that it did. Now, if I were to remove my direct reports and change my title, then the individual contributor activity would fire. So, again, just to recap, you want to have a script which sets activity.result to some value, and then you want to have an output condition which you can add by first checking out your workflow, obviously, and then right-clicking on the header and going to add condition. And in that condition, you want to give it a friendly name. And in the condition you want, in the condition of the condition, you want activity.result double equals some value, or activity.result.toString triple equals some value. And just in case you're not familiar, the double equals allows things like coercion, which is where you have one data type and you want to compare it. So, like, let's say var is this a number equals, let's say 3 equals 3. So this expression, which is evaluated and saved to this variable, in this case, this would be false, because we're comparing a number, an integer 3, to a string 3. JavaScript is right coercive, which means whatever data type is provided on the far right of an expression is what all of the other stuff that needs to be coerced will be coerced into. But when we use the strict comparator, that's 3 equal signs, it doesn't do that. So if we remove one, double equals for comparison, this will actually evaluate to true, because 3, the integer, will be coerced to a string. And when it's coerced to a string before this comparison, it then becomes equal to the string 3. Let's just do a quick example here. If I come over here, say 3 double equals string 3, that's true, but if we do a triple equals, that is false. And that leads to some really weird stuff. So it's something that you definitely need to keep in mind as a developer. But well, just for exactly this reason, for example, it caught me up in this case. I'm actually kind of glad I was able to demonstrate that. Now, if we were to do something like var t equals 3, and then t.toString, that's going to convert the number 3 to the string 3. So if I were to do t.toString triple equals 3 in a string, That is true because we've cast it to a string, which is a primitive variable type. So by casting it to a string, we don't have to rely on coercion, so our strict comparison works. Anyway, this is a complete tangent. The point is, you can add all of these output transitions. You can add as many as you like. You can right-click and delete them to your heart's content. I hope this has been helpful for you. If it has, and you want to hear more of my inane ramblings, head on over to snprotips.com. That's SN like ServiceNow, protips.com. You can also find my book with information on this and all kinds of other best practices and super pedantic guidelines about how to be the best developer that you can be, called the ServiceNow Development Handbook, a compendium of pro tips, guidelines, best practices. It's less than 100 pages, super dense. I've also got my book, Learning ServiceNow, out there at books.sngeek.com. And I'll show you all my books, my Amazon author page. There's also ServiceNow, Building Powerful Workflows, which is another book, and I'll be releasing the second edition of my first book, which was Learning ServiceNow, very soon. I hope that you will check them out, as well as the blog, which is again at snprotips.com. If you have any questions for me, snprotips.com is also a great way to get in touch with me. You can ask questions. I might feature your questions in a video, and I might answer them in that video and send you the video. I can be reached on Twitter at @TheTimWoodruff. You can find me on the web there, or again at snprotips. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.